So we're privileged here to have Alan Johnson. He's a distinguished politician, has been MP for Hull West and Hessle since 1997, has held various cabinet positions under the Blair and Brown government, so give him a big round of applause and thanks for coming here tonight.
First question is, your two memoirs have won many awards, including the All-World Prize. What was your inspiration for writing them, and will the third one dish the dirt on your time in politics?
Right. I hope everyone can hear, but what was the inspiration for me writing my memoirs? Well, when the electorate decided they'd had enough of us in 2010, I'd been a minister for 11 years, and there was suddenly a bit of time to spare. There was interest in an Alan Johnson book. And my agent, who's an American guy called Andrew Kidd, who's the only American I know who's a season ticket holder at Queen's Park Rangers, the finest team in the world, of course, he said, why don't you write about your childhood? And I suppose for anybody who lost someone when they were young, when you were young and they were young, you kind of didn't really know them. So it suddenly occurred to me that I had the chance, in a sense, to be my mother's biographer, and to tell her story, and to step back, which is why I don't call them mother and father, I call them Lily and Steve, and sort of recreate her on the page, and that was a huge kind of privilege. So I tried to tell the story of a place, a period, and two people, basically my mother and my sister. And the place was Notting Hill, although we didn't see Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts around our way very much. More accurately, it's North Kensington. It's a real slum area of West London, where in the 1951 census, in the whole of London, the density of people to a room was 2.1. And in this little ward, the Goulburn ward of where we lived in Southern Street, it was 13 to a room, as the average. So it's always been a poor and very sort of desperate area. So to tell the story of that place and that period, that post-war early 50s, which for many people who major in nostalgia and politics, that there was always this great age back in the 50s, it didn't seem like that to me. It seemed a very brutal, a very hard life, particularly if you came from any kind of minority, and particularly if you were a woman, and particularly if you were a woman left on her own. So I wanted to tell that story.
So just briefly picking up from what you said there, you know.
Sorry, the third one will definitely dish the dirt if that's what you're interested in, because I want people to buy it. By the time you bought it and I've got the royalty, it's too late.
Just going on from what you said there, you know, if you go to Notting Hill today, you know, reeks of affluence and wealth, you know, all the gated houses. Obviously, it's a far cry from 107 Southern Street from where you grew up. So, do you remember much about your time there? What kind of sticks in your mind from where you grew up in that area?
Well, you have to be quite accurate about this. Notting Hill was always posh. I mean, my mother used to go and clean and wait the table and all that in Notting Hill. And that's West 11. We were in West 10. And the difference between the two was very stark. So there's always been that, for anyone who knows the area at all, if you walk up the Portobello Road from our end, which was the rough end, it's like a sociology lesson. You pass through every social class until you get to Holland Park at the top, which is very prosperous, and the top end of Ladbroke Road, very prosperous. So there was always this cheek by jowl poverty. So it's not particularly true to say that Notting Hill has become gentrified. What happened is North Kensington got called Notting Hill. But so where we were, there were the Notting Hill race riots. Kelso Cochrane was murdered on the corner of my street. I remember those signs in shop windows, room to let, no Irish, no dogs, no blacks. You know, the West Indian, mainly West Indian, Caribbean, Trinidad and Jamaica, guys who were asked to come over, who were in the Commonwealth, what had very recently been the Empire, and because there was a shortage of labour, they were asked to come over and drive our buses and push our hospital trolleys and deliver our post. I mean, they probably weren't expecting a ticker-tape reception, but what they got was squalid conditions, the conditions that we lived in, but people like Rackman were exploiting those conditions, and a lot of hostility. And So that was happening in West 10, it wasn't happening in West 11. So, you know, let's look on the positive side. It's now, I was there last night actually, it's now doing an event in a school there. It's now a very multiracial, very comfortable with its cosmopolitan nature. But if you're a young person there trying to get on the housing ladder, same as that practically anywhere in London, you know, even in Standard Records you have to have over 100,000 a year to get a house, to buy a house. My mother's dream was of a council house, our own house. Fortunately, we were with a housing association, the Row Housing Trust. But living in a house with 16 other families and whatever, 4 other families, typically 16 people. But her dream was her own front door, which she never got. But that social housing doesn't exist to the same degree, even that it did. You know, there's a housing crisis as desperate as there was just after the war now.
In your memoirs, you talk a lot about your mum Lily and sister Linda. Where do you think you would be without them?
Oh, crikey. I mean, I say in the dedication to my sister, she kept me safe. My mother, of course, did her very best, but she died young. So we'd have had completely different lives, but the story in there is also of Mr. Pepper, the social worker. So there we were, you know, aged 15 and 13 when our mother died. So my father was gone when I was 8. So I said to my sister, what do we do? She said, just keep quiet, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody at school, don't tell the authorities, or they'll split us up. But 2 weeks after my mum died, she got the offer of a council house that she'd been dreaming of in Welling Garden City. So my sister, told you what she's like, she marched off to the council. So my mother's dead, but we'll have this house. And the council said, don't be silly, you have to be 21. That was the age of adulthood then. I'll send a social worker round. And it was this social worker, Mr. Pepper, who came round. And he said, right, I've sorted all this out. I've got a foster parent for Alan. It was in the front room of this other son who lived in Walmer Road. And I was there. So he said to Linda, I've got this foster parent for Alan near his school. And Linda, who left school at 15 to train to be a nursery nurse, you can go to Dr. Bernardo's at Barkingside, you can continue your training, and you can live there, live in there. And he sat back thinking we were going to say thank you, and Linda tore into him and said, you're not going to split us up. And he said, well, you can't be on your own. She said, we've been on our own for years, as we had. My mother was in and out of hospital with a heart complaint. So it's just by way of explaining, you know, how much I owe to my sister. So in the end, Mr. Pepper, social workers tell me today that they could not do this. He took this big risk. He came back and said, okay, I've sorted it out. There were some conditions attached, including he had to come every 5 minutes to watch over us. You can have a council flat, a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. But they probably thought, just like with students, they'll give you the most horrible place on the books. So Linda went to look at this place. She said they'd take the doors off to burn as firewood. And she went to the phone box. For anyone of a certain age, you'll know you put 4pence in, press button A, and got through to Mr. Pepper. And Mr. Pepper said, have you seen it? She said, we're not taking it. He said, you can't negotiate with me. She said, well, you go and look at it, and if you think you can live there with your family, come and look me in the eye and tell me. And that was the last we heard of it. We got this lovely masonette on a number 11 pit house on the Wilberforce estate in Battersea, which meant we had to go south of the Thames, which was obviously a trauma for us, but we got over it. But if Mr. Pepper hadn't made that decision, if we'd have been split up and institutionalised, you know, I've got nothing against the institutions, but for us that would have been entirely the wrong thing to do. So we owe him, that social worker, making that one decision, which if I'd have been found in a back street injecting heroin, you know, he'd have lost his job, there'd have been a big scandal and all the rest of it. But he took that chance and took that risk.
Well, Alan, you know, the 60s and 70s were a very radical time to be growing up in Britain, with a lot of social change and changing social norms. Today, being married at 18, you know, it would be something which is quite surprising, and being a father not long after as well. How did you kind of deal with those pressures, or was it something you kind of took on greatly?
Father at 18, because I married a single mother. Listen, it wasn't that. I mean, the 60s was a time of great social change, but in working class communities where we lived, that hadn't really infiltrated. You know, it was still, for my first wife, extremely difficult to be a single mother. you know, the idea, I say in the book, you know, we saw what was happening on the streets in France and the student revolution that was going on around, and Tariq Ali, who wanted to abolish money. We just wanted to earn the bloody stuff. We were in a different situation, and so really that didn't touch us. But what you have to remember, as I explain in the book, my first wife was an orphan. Her mother died in childbirth. She was brought up by her grandparents. So for us, we were kind of keen to get into family life, whereas all our friends wanted to get out of family life. So there was a different, I suppose, impetus for us. And I think now, you know, society is a lot more relaxed about those things, although, you know, having 3 kids by the time they're 20, which was me, is not advisable. But try telling your kids that when they say, "Oh, you got married when you know." So I have difficulty with my children over that.
And so then you signed up to Royal Mail. And what was your most exciting encounter as a postman? Were there any houses you hated delivering to? Or do you just regret not living out your dream as a rock star?
Oh, I don't know why you assume that my dream of being a rock star is over. I'm still I mean, just to give you a glimpse into my genius, when I was 18, I wrote a song called Bad Skin about a kid with acne. And the middle 8 was, how can any girl want to be with you when every kiss she gets just tastes of Nivea, which I it's copyrighted, by the way. So when my second band broke up, after there was this crime wave following me around, and eventually my precious Hofner very thin guitar got nicked. And the bass guitarist was a West Indian guy called Sham, and he said, "Let's form another band." I said, "I can't, I'm just about to get married, blah, blah, blah." And Sham was a postman in North London. And he said, "Why don't you join the post office? You know, wages are poor. As a result, they can't recruit any staff. As a result, there's tons of overtime. So if you want to work long hours, you can earn a fortune." And so I joined, not in North London, because North London was a foreign country to me. I joined in Barnes in Southwest 13 as a uniformed civil servant. It was the General Post Office. You had to sign the Official Secrets Act. You were a civil servant. And I try and describe what that was like in the kind of late 60s.
So I think, just going back to that, in your book you mentioned a particular kind of delivery which you did, and there was this lady who would, you know, lift up her top and, you know, show her breasts. The postman just wondered if you could...
We got the right age. Okay, this goes back to your question that I didn't answer about what was my most difficult experience. Well, it wasn't that. It was. Let's keep that one out there. I'd also described doing this delivery around a place called Littleworth Common in Buckinghamshire, which was a proper rural delivery, where you delivered the newspapers, you delivered coal for the elderly. No way they could get it delivered if it wasn't for you. You had sacks of manure going from the farmer to the market gardener. We used to carry the odd person in the back. Actually, we didn't have much time to deliver the mail. We had too much other stuff to deliver. But we used to go to this place, deliver to this place where there was an Irish wolfhound. It was, as you went in the gate, and this wolfhound looked you in the eye. It was the height that you were. And my 2 mates who did the round with me, it was a rotation, they said all it wants to do is to take your arm in its teeth and take you to the door gently to deliver the mail, and then let you go again. But, you know, as I say in the book, it was like being, you know, like a kindly usherette showing someone to their seat in a cinema or something. But that was pretty petrifying. But I did it, and I never got bitten. But I had to wipe all the spittle off my arm in the mail sack afterwards.
Well, by today's standards, your background and your route into politics is somewhat unusual. You know, you haven't been to Oxbridge, you haven't studied politics, you haven't had an internship in Westminster. And do you think that a young person in your circumstances today would ever dream of entering politics, and does the lack of diversity amongst the Westminster elite concern you?
Well, I left school at 15 with no qualifications. It would be difficult now to do that. Then you could walk into literally millions of jobs that didn't require qualifications. A lot tougher now. And so I don't think mine is a kind of, you know, template for others to follow. In terms of going into politics, yes, of course it's still possible. Of course it is. I feel there's two ways about this. First of all, there are people who do have my kind of background. You don't hear very much about them. I mean, as a postman, just been elected for the Conservative Party down in Cornwall. And I checked to see whether being a postman meant you did a week as a Christmas casual. And no, you did 23 years as a postman. There's a taxi driver. For those people like me who think it's a shame that people who really know how to run the country are too busy driving cabs, there is a taxi driver called Clive Atherd. There's 2 miners, there's a gas fitter on our benches. They don't get a lot of coverage. But I think people were worried that that route you talk about, Ben, was becoming the only route in, that there needs to be other routes into politics. But the second thing I worry about is if we start saying there's something actually wrong with having a university degree and getting a PPE from Oxford or Cambridge, well, that's wrong. I mean, you don't mind me quoting you, but I know because your grandmother, Kathy, who's here, told me you're the first in your generation to go to university. You come from a working class background. Your parents and the parents of working class kids like you, who after the war decided that only 4% going to university was where it was an elite, it was the preserve of a privileged elite, that they wanted to break those barriers down. They did that, and if their grandchildren now find that in the Labour Party it counts against them, it would be equally tragic.
Moving on to the current EU debate, earlier this year you were appointed to lead Labour's staying campaign. After the appointment of your new leader, are you still going ahead, and what benefits does the EU bring?
Yeah, of course we're going ahead. We had our conference, Jesus, what week we had? Well, it was actually last week, yeah, still last week. On the Monday of that conference, we debated Europe, and we came out absolutely united. And Jeremy, I'd seen Jeremy the week before, he's absolutely clear that we stay in Europe. We stay in to reform Europe. And reform isn't an event, it's a process. Yeah. What benefits does it bring? Well, you know, people will hear this ad nauseum over the coming weeks and months, I think. I mean, my belief and the belief of the Labour Party is that actually in an increasingly interdependent world where it's very difficult to solve problems in one country, those problems of climate change, those problems of energy security, those problems of security per se, that working with our continent, with other countries on our continent, is what we should be doing. There's a huge market there, a single market of 500 million people, but it's a market with rules. Rules to protect the workers, working time directive, the right to paternity leave, maternity leave, etc., 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 all of that, and rules for consumers to protect consumers as well. And of course, it's not a perfect institution. Neither is the Houses of Parliament, by the way. But you know, the idea that we turn our back on it and walk away is, to me, I can't contemplate where that puts Britain's place in it. So, you know, that is the view of the Labour Party. There's a Labour No campaign that started today, which has got 5 MPs and a man and a dog, not the Irish Wolfhound. But that doesn't reflect, and that's fine. You know, we'll have these debates. But the Labour Party position, our absolute position decided at our conference, is we vote for a yes, irrespective of what Cameron comes back, because that's a kind of sideshow. And we're not voting on his package. We're voting on whether we stay in or not.
Yeah, and in the run-up to the 2015 general election, there were many calls from within the party, both publicly and privately, for you to take over from Ed Miliband. I just wondered, what stopped you, and why didn't you stand in the recent Labour leadership election?
Well, the second question answers the first. Ed Miliband was the elected leader. I hadn't stood as the leader. The idea that 6 months before the election he should be stabbed in the back and I should step across his body, there'd be blood on the walls, by the way, within the party. I take the crown and then say the British people elect us into government because we're a responsible, united party, was too ridiculous for words. You know, I don't do treachery. And if I wanted to be leader, I'd have stood in 2010. I didn't. If I wanted to be leader, I'd have stood in 2015. I didn't. I had no ambition to be the leader. It's not, you know, and if you don't want to do it, you're not going to do it very well, quite frankly.
What was it like to briefly serve under Ed Miliband as Shadow Chancellor?
It's fine. We got on very well. And actually, you know, I think Ed had some excellent policies, most of which are being nicked by George Osborne and the Tories at the moment. Where I think he, for some unfathomable reason, because we're talking about me as Shadow Chancellor, about the economy, we failed to get over, we failed to kill the lie about how the deficit emerged and where it came from. And we failed to attack Osborne on his failure on practically every target he set. And we failed to explain the difference between us and them on austerity. And the first one, I think, is because Ed wanted to fight the 2015 election, not the 2010 election over again, which was fine as a general theory, but on this economy, with this idea that, you know, don't give the keys back to the driver who drove the car into the ditch. This was very powerful language from the Tories. And we found it impossible to address it. And that news night, a week before, Thursday before, you know, Ed ran into that and seemed to be perplexed by it. And I think if you could pick out one moment and one thing, it was that. Obviously, there's loads of others, and everyone will have their own opinion. But, you know, I thought he was very, because we were going to borrow to invest. Interest rates are zero. Borrowing to do the kind of infrastructure things that need doing, getting growth in the economy, getting people back to work. Still not out of the woods. You know, there's been a bit of growth now. But actually, if you took every civil servant and minister out of the Treasury and filled it, replaced them with Saxa King Edward Spuds, there would eventually be growth in the economy. That's the way the economy works. The trick is to do it quicker than the Tories managed to do.
And I guess the big question is, where should Labour go under controversy, you know, Jeremy Corbyn? And what do you say to moderate MPs who cannot stomach the new direction?
We're on camera here. This is a bit like Jeremy Paxman, this. What do I think? I have been loyal to every leader since I joined the party 40 odd years ago, and I'll be loyal to Jeremy, and so should my colleagues. What do we want to do? We want to win the next election. This is, I think, the kind of debate that's going on. Are we a party of protest or are we a party of government? Does being a party of government mean you ditch your principles? Well, of course it doesn't. We were created in 1900 by 127 trade unionists, with Keir Hardie, just 100 years since he died, bringing together socialist societies, the Fabians and the trade union movement, to get power for working people. That's the one thing it was aimed at. And of course, you know, on the basis of our principles, we're for the eradication of poverty and greater equality. Everything else are means towards those ends. So you know, that's the debate that's going on. We have to win the election. You know, I gave my views on Jeremy when I did the Guardian piece supporting Yvette Cooper. When you have an election, you champion your own candidates. Now it's over. We have to unite behind the elected leader.
Okay, really serious question now for you, Alan. Okay, if you're in a room with Blair, Brown and Miliband, which one would you marry, snog and avoid? In all seriousness though, who was the most difficult to work with?
Oh, Gordon. Camera there. No, I do respect Gordon, and Gordon, you know, actually, when the history books are written, Gordon will be getting a better write-up, particularly what he did in galvanising the G20 and stopping a recession becoming a depression, a la 1930s. Gordon was largely, most people around the world think he was largely credited. But the problem with Gordon is he wasn't comfortable in his own skin. So when you're working for him or working to, I was his health secretary and then his home secretary, you always got the tension kind of went round everybody else. There was no feeling of calmness, and there was no feeling that, you know, here's where I want to be and here's the way I'm going to get there. With Gordon, it seemed much like riding by the seat of his pants. And in many ways you can understand that. You know, if you ever wonder why Alistair Darling was the only person ever to go to a Leonard Cohen concert to cheer himself up, read his memoirs. You know, second biggest bank in the world said if you don't do something within soon, people are going to be standing at cash points with no money coming out. Their mortgage is gone, their savings gone. And when Alistair said, what do you mean soon? Do you mean next week? You mean tomorrow? 3 hours. 3 hours we had. So it was an interesting time to be in government. But I would say that Gordon probably didn't have that kind of skill that Tony and Ed and the other leaders I've known. I've worked with Kenneth Smith, I've worked with them all, had when I was a trade union leader, to kind of calm everybody down and it's not just a skill in politics, it's a skill in life, and to be the leader of an enterprise ship where you know where you're going.
Obviously, in the last week we've seen the death of Dennis Healey, which is an absolute tragedy for British politics and for the centre-left. Do you have any fond memories of Dennis, and what would you say his greatest contribution was?
I do have fond memories of Dennis. If you want to read a really good political biography, a political autobiography, read his, The Time of My Life. It's amazing because he had this incredible hinterland as well. He loved poetry and literature and art. And he'd fought on the beaches of Italy. He was a beach master, which was the most dangerous job in the Second World War as the Allied forces went into Italy. So he'd had all these incredible experiences. My memory of him is probably like most people, his fantastic quotes. So it was him who said, and I was brought up in this generation where you're on the left, you either went down the revolutionary socialist route or you went down the democratic socialist route. And the Communist Party was a big influence, and a big influence in the trade union. I say in Please Mr. Postman about my hero was Jimmy Reed. But I never joined the Communist Party because it always seemed to me after Hungary and Prague and all of that the only way to maintain a workers' state was with a secret police force, and that I wasn't interested in that route. But Dennis made this fabulous quote that said, if you're not, because he'd been a communist, you're not a communist when you're 18, you lack a heart, and if you're still a communist when you're 38, you lack a brain. And I think kind of summed up the kind of feeling of what you went through on the left during those years.
What are your thoughts on the privatisation of Royal Mail, especially when the shares were undervalued by the coalition, and in light of the fact this was a policy once supported by the Brown government?
Well, no, it wasn't, incidentally. Let me put you right now. I led the campaign in '94 that stopped Heseltine in the major government privatising the post office. There's a great Michael Cockerell film about it called A Word in the Right Ear, and it was a superb campaign, even though I say so myself. And we defeated privatisation, and it was right to defeat it then, and it would have been right to defeat it. And it's a big mistake, not just because they privatised an institution that's been publicly owned for 500 years, and which is part of the social fabric of every community in the country still, but because they split away the post office network from Royal Mail. No country's ever done that before. They're now two completely separate businesses. And eventually services will diminish. For people in rural areas in particular, it won't happen straight away. Eventually there won't be deliveries 6 days a week. There won't be deliveries to the door in remote areas. You have to go and collect your mail. And I know it's an age of internet and things have changed, but actually packets now and parcels, the most common message on the internet is send me something through the post. You can't send books and packages through the internet. So for all of those reasons, it's a huge mistake. Now, we did not say with pride. We set up something called the Hooper Review that said that we ought to change the pension arrangements, we ought to change the regulator, and we ought to introduce some private capital into Royal Mail so that it could compete with all these private. And they said, the Hooper Review said no more than 30%, so 70% would have been publicly owned. It would have been in public owned. 30% being sold to the private sector is not privatisation.
Sorry. Okay. Being a trade union man yourself, how do you view the recent passage of the Tory trade union bill? Do you think it's undemocratic and a partisan attack on workers' rights?
Well, it hasn't passed. It's gone through second reading. And at second reading, David Davis from the Tory benches said there's elements of this that arising of Franco's Spain. And there is. It's a terrible bill. It's a solution without a problem. There is no problem with industrial action in this country, in the sense that it's the lowest level of industrial action. If you take the last 5 years that this government's been in power, It's been amongst the lowest aggregate of industrial action anywhere in the world. This is about one thing, a tube strike in London. That's what sparked this off. And what comes with it is not just the ludicrous, undemocratic notion that people who don't vote in an election, the people who miss the post, it has to be a postal ballot, by the way. I suppose I should be pleased about that as an ex-postman. But you can't use electronic means to vote in an industrial action ballot. You can only use the post. Someone who doesn't vote, for whatever reason, is counted as a no vote. Counted as a no vote. So, and it means that in a, if you are in a workplace with 1,000 people and you get 499 voting for industrial action and not a single person voting against, it's an illegal strike. Illegal under criminal law, not civil law. And just to add to that, if you're an emergency service and the government decides what those are, there's 5 at the moment, including the nuclear power industry, you have to meet another threshold of 40% having to vote in favour, which in effect means it's 80%, because if 50% vote to meet that threshold, and 40% of them, 40% have to vote yes, 40 as a percentage of 50 is 80%. So this is incredible stuff. There's nowhere, I don't know of anywhere in the world, no one can tell me it, I don't know of anyone, even a golf club, where people who don't vote are counted as no. All the laws of democracy say that the votes are counted on the votes cast, and you don't allude to the people who don't vote a certain position, whether it's yes or no. Aside from that, there's all kinds of rules about picket lines and about the organisers of a strike having to tell the employer about what messages they're sending out on social media, let alone anything else. So what they put on Twitter and Facebook and all that. It's horrendous.